There is a subtle moment in a person's financial life that rarely gets discussed, yet it quietly changes how they think, how they act, and how they relate to money. It happens somewhere between $1,000 and $10,000. On the surface, this looks like a simple increase in savings, just an extra digit in an account. But psychologically, it is a threshold where money stops feeling temporary and starts feeling structural. At $1,000, money still feels fragile, easily disrupted by a single expense, a minor emergency, or an impulsive decision. And because of that fragility, most decisions remain short-term in nature. Spending is reactive, saving is inconsistent, and investing feels distant or even unnecessary because the base itself does not feel stable. As that number approaches 10,000, something begins to shift internally. The money starts to feel less like a buffer and more like a system. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this today?" the question slowly evolves into, "How does this decision affect my position over time?" This is not just a financial shift, but a cognitive one, where the brain begins to recognize patterns instead of isolated events. Behavioral economists often describe this as a transition from scarcity-driven thinking to early-stage stability, where decisions are no longer dominated by immediate pressure, but by emerging structure. The person has not become wealthy, not even close, but they have crossed into a zone where time starts to matter more than urgency. The mathematics behind this shift is not dramatic, but it is meaningful. At $1,000, even a relatively strong annual return produces outcomes that feel negligible in absolute terms, which reinforces the idea that growth is slow and perhaps not worth the effort. When that base becomes 10,000, the same percentage change begins to produce visible movement, and that visibility matters more than the number itself. Humans are not purely rational with numbers. They respond to feedback, to noticeable change, to signals that their actions are producing results. When growth becomes visible, consistency becomes easier, and when consistency improves, the system begins to reinforce itself. This is where many people unknowingly diverge. Some individuals treat $10,000 as a milestone to relax, a signal that they have done enough for now, which often leads to stagnation or regression because the underlying habits have not fully solidified. Others interpret the same number as proof that a system is working, and they begin to focus less on the amount and more on the process that created it. This difference in interpretation leads to very different long-term outcomes, not because of the number itself, but because of the behavior it triggers. The threshold is not important for its size, but for the meaning assigned to it. There's also a hidden structural element at play. Below a certain level, money is constantly exposed to disruption. Small setbacks can erase months of progress, which creates a feedback loop of frustration and inconsistency. As the base grows, volatility at the personal level decreases, not because external risks disappear, but because the system can absorb them. This absorption capacity is rarely discussed, yet it is one of the defining characteristics of financial stability. It allows decisions to be made with slightly more patience, slightly more objectivity, and slightly less emotional interference. When viewed through a broader economic lens, this threshold mirrors larger systems. Entire economies operate on similar principles, where reserves, buffers, and capital bases determine how resilient they are to shocks. The individual experience between $1,000 and $10,000 is essentially a miniature version of this larger dynamic. It is the point where survival starts to transition into early-stage resilience, where the focus shifts from immediate continuity to gradual expansion. What makes this shift particularly interesting is that it is not visible from the outside. Two individuals can appear nearly identical in income, lifestyle, and even savings, yet internally they may be operating under completely different financial frameworks. One is still reacting to money, while the other is beginning to manage it as a system. Over time, this internal difference compounds into external divergence, often in ways that are difficult to trace back to a single moment. The identity shift that occurs here is quiet but significant. Money stops being something that simply comes in and goes out and starts becoming something that can be directed, structured, and gradually expanded. The person begins to see themselves not just as someone who earns, but as someone who allocates. This shift in identity does not guarantee any specific outcome, but it changes the trajectory of decision-making in a consistent direction. In the end, the movement from 1,000 to 10,000 is not about reaching a specific number, but about crossing a psychological and structural boundary. It is where money begins to behave differently, not because the rules have changed, but because the relationship to those rules has evolved. And once that relationship changes, the entire financial system around a person, from their habits to their expectations, begins to reorganize itself in subtle but lasting ways.